Make it here. I just arrived when it started to rain, and I see that you were able to make it. Maybe more people will come.
Professor Zaki Laïdi is one of the most prominent geopolitical analysts. He has a chair at the Sciences Po, the famous School of Political Science. He was my special advisor, senior advisor, when I was as High Representative. He has a lot of ideas. He has just written a book called Hedgers, making reference to the states who are not in one side or the other. It depends on the day, and it depends on the issue. They can be with us or can be against us. There are many hedges in the world. The world is becoming more and more uncertain. And you know that in facing uncertainty in the stock exchange, what do? Is the diversification. When you don't know, then you diversify your investments. Just in case you don't say, you don't do the good asset here, maybe you do that there. In international politics, the same thing happens, more and more. The hedges are not the so-called non-aligned countries. Remember? Los países no alineados in the time of the Cold War. It's not exactly the same thing, but they are not aligned. His book is becoming a reference in order to study the behavior of the states in the international politics. And he has been with us a couple of days discussing with our researchers. And now is the time for a public lecture. I'm sorry because it's going to be less public than expected due to the fact that the public cannot be able to come here. But anyway, I'm sure you will give presentations followed by a discussion. I know that you have some slides in order to explain better with figures and facts, which are your thesis about the world, the way it is, where we are heading. Heading and hedging, they are two different words. So, Professor Zaki Laïdi, go.
Okay. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for your kind words. Great pleasure for me to be here. Actually, I arrived yesterday, and I have a very productive meeting with colleagues and scholars, and I'm sure that we're going to have an interesting discussion. So let me just start with the explanation on the title. The best way to understand the title is actually to look at the subtitle. And the subtitle is how the Global South navigates the Sino-American competition, okay? So it's a first indication on the content. So in the literature, the concept of hedgers doesn't exist. So that's the first time we're using this word. But what exists is the concept of hedging. And hedging, by reference to finance, is a strategy aiming at minimizing risk in an uncertain context. So this idea is applied to international relations. And what we've tried to say in this book is that basically all states tend to hedge in the international system because they all want to increase their leverage, they all want to increase their influence, they all want to maximize the benefits, but of course they don't have always the means to do so. What we call the hedgers are a particular type of actors among those countries who are hedging, who have instruments, who have heft, who have structural power to influence the international system. So the book starts with a definition of the international system today. In which kind of international system are we living? Are we living in a bipolar system? Are we living in a multipolar system? We came to the conclusion that, and which was actually our hypothesis, is that the best way to understand the international system today is to define the international system as a hybrid system in which dynamics of new bipolarity are interacting with more multipolarity. So I personally don't believe that we are in a full-fledged multipolar system. I do believe that, in a sense, we are in a more bipolar system than we used to be during the Cold War, because during the Cold War, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was ideological, was political, was military, but was never economic or technological, because the West and the United States has a huge hedge on the Soviet Union. Today, if you look at the situation, the competition between the United States and China is much larger, much wider. It covers all areas. And in a sense, the system is, by definition, more bipolar. If you add up, for example, the figures, you see that the addition of the US GDP with the Chinese GDP represent at least 45% of the world GDP, okay? So which is a significant figure. Now, the world is always more complex, because if indeed by certain standards the world system is more bipolar, on the other hand, the nature of alignment on the poles is much more, is looser today than it used to be 30 or 40 years ago. If you take the countries, even within the alliances, you see that countries tend to retain more autonomy of action, okay? So the hedgers are the actors from the global south, which are middle-income countries, which have a certain number of resources I'm going to talk about, which help them to sustain a position of more autonomy within the international system, and to take advantage of the competition between the United States and China. In other words, instead of looking at those countries as passive actors who are only submitted to the constraint of bipolarity, we argue that they are active actors in this bipolarity, and within this framework, they are increasing or trying to increase their margin of maneuver, okay? So that's the sense of hedgers. And hedgers, so that's why we moved from hedging to hedgers, because we do argue that this position of those actors is not just a transition, it's structural. They are contributing to the new structure of the international system, which, as I said, need to be read in terms of interaction between bipolarity and multipolarity. We don't need to have to choose between bipolarity and multipolarity. We have to work on the interaction between both processes. Now, in order to conduct this research, we thought that we need to give some evidence, and strong evidence, of this hypothesis. And in order to give evidence, or to find evidence, you need to define metrics on which the hedgers are defining their strategy. In other words, we've tried to define the factors which help those countries to shape their strategy and sustain their hedging policy over time. So this is very important. So what are those factors? The first has to do with the ranking of those countries in the world GDP. And if you look at the trajectory of those countries since the end of the Cold War in 1990 till 2024, you see a significant rise of all those countries in the ranking in terms of GDP, running from the 5th position for India, which was 9 in 1990 at the end of the Cold War, to Qatar, which is now number 40 with 2 million inhabitants, 40 in terms of GDP, which is absolutely huge. It was 70 in the 90s. You see the dramatic improvement, the more spectacular being the case of Vietnam, which was holding the 63rd position at the end of the Cold War and is now number 25. So you have India, you have Brazil, you have Indonesia, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Vietnam, we took South Africa, the UAE, and Qatar. So the GDP and the evolution, the dynamic of hedging, of the hedgers, towards a more prominent position within the global system through the measurement of their GDP. That's the first metric. The second metric has to do with their financial clout, their financial power, their resources, the financial resources. And here again, when you look at the ranking, you are surprised by the prominent position acquired by those countries in acquiring financial resources. So financial resources are based, as it's said under the table, on basically sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and reserves of their central banks. And you have two countries who are talking a lot these days, the Emirates and the Saudi Arabia, which are on the 5th and 6th position in the world, which is absolutely tremendous. India 14, Qatar 18, Brazil 20, so Indonesia 22, South Africa 26, and Vietnam 30, okay? So all those countries have seen their resources increasing in a significant way. And this matters, of course, in the international competition. The third parameter, or the third metric, has to do with the military power. But in order to assess the military capabilities, you have different ways of doing so. You have the ranking in terms of military expenditure, but we realize that measuring or taking into account military expenditure is not enough. We have to take into account another dimension, which is what we call the firepower. Indice de puissance de feu, which refers to the efficiency of the military forces. So what is interesting, and particularly in the context we're living today in the Middle East, is to see the discrepancy in the case of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar between the immense resources they are devoting to defense. Saudi Arabia is seventh in terms, ranks number 7 in military expenditure in the world, which is huge. The Emirates 15, Qatar 25. But what is interesting is the discrepancy for those three countries between the level of their military expenditure and the efficiency of their military power. And in Saudi Arabia, 7, but 24. Emirates, 15, 54. Qatar, 25, 72. So there's a huge discrepancy, which means basically that they are buying a lot of armament in order to gain the support of the United States, roughly speaking, okay? But with limited achievements. But this is not the case of all countries, because look at Vietnam. Vietnam is 28 in terms of military expenditure, but its position in terms of firepower is 23. It's better than the level of its military expenditure. And for other countries, such as India, for example, there is a balance between the military expenditure and the firepower. Another indicator has to do with the level of integration of those countries in the world economy through global value chains, for example. And here again, we try to measure the contribution of those countries to the export of manufactured products. And here again, you are impressed by the favorable position of those countries, with Vietnam, number 10, okay, number 10 among exporting countries in the world. It's absolutely fascinating. India, which had, I mean, and just look at the figures. I mean, Vietnam has 60 million inhabitants. India has 1.5 billion, and still Vietnam export more than India, of course, because India has also an internal market. But you see the Emirates, 17, Indonesia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Qatar. All of them, excepted Qatar, are in the first 25 countries. So the ranking is impressive. So we have here countries who have a significant role in the world system, and that explain their strategy. Because here again, if you want to hedge, you need to have the resources to hedge. Okay, it's not just a matter of choice. Another parameter we've tried to work on is the evolution of their trade with both the United States and China. And here again, you see a deep correspondence between economic trends and geopolitical trends. When you look at the evolution of export vis-à-vis the United States, you have one outstanding case, which is the case of Vietnam, okay, which basically exported nothing to the United States 3 decades ago, and now export 31% of its export to the United States. The second is interesting because it is India. India has also increased its export vis-à-vis the United States, and this is largely related with the tension with China. So it's a way for India to compensate, let's say, the resource offered by China. And this is a political choice which had been made by the Indians after, I mean, during the last 2 decades or so. For the other countries, you realize that the United States is not an important source for exporting. Apart from Vietnam and India, for the other countries, the United States is not a major partner for their export. And this is very important because it has to be compared to what's happening with China. And it's basically the reverse. So look at the evolution of the export of those countries towards China. So you see in all cases, excepted India, which is related to the previous factor, the political factor, the choice made by the Indian leadership to reduce its relationship with China for political reason and to hedge, in a sense, in increasing its relationship with the United States. All the other countries have seen their export towards China increasing in a very, very dramatic way, with this very spectacular case, which is the case of Brazil, which virtually didn't trade with China in 1990, and now export 28% of its exports are made with China. So it's a huge and a significant change. And in Latin America, Chile is in virtually the same position. I think even more. It's around 32% with China. And those changes have taken place. Look, the rising trend since 2010. All the other countries, including the countries of the Gulf, have significantly increased their export toward China. And if you compare the United States to China, today, the United States virtually do not import oil from the Middle East. The country, the most important trading partner in oil for the Middle East countries is now today China. Okay? So we are here in front of significant changes, and even, so you see the Emirates, you see also Vietnam, who has also significantly increased its relationship, trade relationship with China. And in the case of Vietnam, in this regard, very interesting, because it is the rise of the trade between Vietnam and China which explain the rise of the trade between Vietnam and the United States. Okay, the Vietnamese are imports from China and using them for the export towards the United States, for example. So for all countries excepted India, but things have been reversed those 2 recent years. There was a massive increase of the relationship with China, and it's really quite impressive in terms of figures. Imports, in regard to imports from the United States, here again, what is impressive is that there is virtually a decline of the imports from the United States in all major countries, okay? So the United States, paradoxically, with the exception of Vietnam and India, is a much less relevant economic partner than China today. Here, another metric which measures the evolution of imports from China in the hedging countries. And here you see also a very significant rise in all countries, including India, from China. In other words, it's virtually becoming impossible to bypass China when you want to trade at the international level and when you play a significant role in the world economy today. So it's a major lesson. Another way, another metric to assess, let's say, the heft of the hedging countries, of the hedgers, is to assess their role they play in regional organization. And here again, most of them play a significant role in at least one regional organization. The Quad for India, but with Trump, I think that the Quad is about to decline significantly. So for India is going to be a problem. For Brazil is, of course, Mercosur. For South Africa, it's the African Union. For Saudi Arabia, it's the CGC. For Qatar also. For the UAE. And the only exception is Vietnam, which play a limited role in the ASEAN. And for example, when they've been hit by very strong tariffs from the United States, they immediately went to Washington to discuss and to deal with the United States without consultation with their neighbors. Whereas the main reason why the Americans hit the Vietnam very strongly is because, and they have good reason to think so, that Vietnam is used by China as a source of transshipment to the United States. Okay, so the Chinese using Vietnam to export, to bypass the tariffs from the United States, and that's actually the main difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. Under Trump 1, the American administration basically took into account the partners with which they had a deficit. In Trump 2, they have refined the system and took into account the countries which are involved in transshipment. Okay. Here is another metric which is fascinating and which we lived with Josep for many years after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, is the way those countries have reacted to the war in Ukraine. And I will say, frankly, that the idea of writing that book came after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and the way those countries have behaved. So, if you look at the significant votes on the different resolutions, so we took the 12, okay, yeah. There were 12 resolutions on Ukraine of different nature. And we have tried to analyze the patterns of voting of those countries. So if you go on the right-hand side, you see the outcome, and you realize that on average, 72% of those countries have abstained. Okay? With one country who abstained on all resolution, which was India. Vietnam was close to that result, excepted on one resolution on which Vietnam voted with Russia. And it was the resolution related to the expulsion of Russia from the United Nations Council on Human Rights. So they didn't want to abstain, and then they aligned on Russia because they felt they didn't want to integrate or take into account human rights in the resolution on Ukraine. But the majority of those hedgers have abstained. But in fact, when you analyze more closely the patterns of voting, I came to the conclusion that between those who voted with us on Ukraine and those who abstained, the difference are minimal in the Global South. Because all of them, or the vast majority of them, saw or read the conflict as an aggression of a foreign country against the sovereignty of a nation, an independent state. And and obviously all those countries have problems of borders. So they are very sensitive to the respect of their national sovereignty. So on the idea of violating the sovereignty of an independent countries, there was a broad consensus. So some abstained for tactical reason, some voted against Russia, but at the end of the day, they came to the conclusion, and the conclusion is, okay, there was a violation of international law, the Russian violated the international law, but don't expect from us, and we heard that many times, to go beyond that condemnation. And if you want us to align on you, to condemn Russia, to sanction Russia, to put our relationship with Russia at risk, we're not going to follow you. So after that, they may have voted for, they may have abstained, but fundamentally, the pattern is the same. Okay, that's bad, but don't expect us to go beyond that point. Why? Because fundamentally, they see the problem of Ukraine as a problem of border between two countries, okay? And the Indians may argue, okay, you are telling us, and that's frankly, the core hypothesis which drove my analysis. You are telling us that the Ukraine war is a war of world order, which concerns the world order. But those countries massively reject this interpretation and see in the conflict a regional problem of border. And the Indians, for example, may argue that, okay, the Russians have violated the sovereignty of Ukraine. You're asking us to align us on you to condemn Russia. But when China is violating our borders, are you aligning on us? No. So we are taking the same stance. And I remember a discussion with the foreign minister, I think it was in Munich, and he told you about the visit he made to Putin, and he told you that Putin was upbeat and so on. And when we raised the question, or you raised the question of what India could do, taking an initiative in favor of peace, like the one that Brazil took, he said no, and he insisted of not taking a political initiative. And after the meeting, I started thinking about this, why Jaishankar was insisting on the idea of not taking an initiative. And I think that I understood. And the reason is the following. That's my interpretation. In their conflict with Pakistan, after the war of 1971, there was an agreement between Pakistan and India known as the Simla Agreement, 1972, in which both countries agreed to disagree, but agreed on one fundamental point, is to deal with the issue of the borders, the conflict between the two countries, on a pure bilateral basis without interference from outside countries. So, since they don't want to see external powers intervening in any regional problem India may have with its neighbors, they decided not to get involved in Ukraine, because if they start intervening or trying to take even a diplomatic initiative on Ukraine, we may come and tell them, or others may come and tell them, okay, you are taking initiative on Ukraine, but you don't accept initiative in your conflict with Pakistan. So all countries have in mind the exclusive defense of their strict national interests. And in this regard, I would like to insist on something which is very important. The Hedgers are not a coalition. Just forget it. They have diverging views, they have diverging perceptions, they have converging views. But look today at the Emiratis, the Saudis, and the Qataris, they have very different views in regard to Iran. Okay? So it's not a club, it's not an alliance. It would be a complete nonsense. But it matters because those actors have enough influence in the world system to play a role and to influence it. And if you look at the Ukraine, okay, the war, what is impressive is the way, for example, the Gulf countries play in the war, but in accommodating the views and the interests of the different parties. They have very good relation with the US on Ukraine, with Europe on Ukraine, with Russia, and with the Ukrainians at the same time. And nobody is disputing their position because they are all gaining. The Russians have gained immensely from the UAE because all their sanctioned economy has basically moved to Dubai. Okay? And they have an interest, and the relationship between Russia and Saudi Arabia in the regulation of the price of oil is also extremely important. Okay, so I may stop here. Of course, we can enter into details, but if you don't mind, I stop here. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Zaki.
Thank you very much, Professor Laïdi. A pleasure to listen to your thoughts, and now we can open the discussion. I think it's important that we let the audience ask you questions about your general understanding of this. I remember that the discussions we've had these days, one of the issues that you mentioned was that the capacity to become a hedger is having the resources, the power to do so. It's not only the willingness not to be aligned or to play a role in this multipolar world, but rather to be able to hedge with the objective to gain national presence or national power in this geopolitical landscape. Something that, and you mentioned now at the end that hedgers will be hedgers. Hedgers will not be forming an alliance or being a counterpower to others, but rather each looking for their own national prerogatives in this world, right? But one question that and it is just to break the ice of other questions that might arise, is what if, this is something we discussed yesterday too, what if the global powers force them to take sides? If the Sino-American competition becomes not only a competition, but more than a competition, so one could think about conflict, about, you mentioned decoupling as one of the strategies that we might witness sooner than later. What if the global powers force these countries to pick sides and say, listen, the world is bipolar, increasingly bipolar, decide. You have to either be on my side or the other side. Is hedging or hedgers, is their position sustainable in that scenario that I'm just putting forward?
Well, in a sense, it's very difficult to answer this question because it is too theoretical. So you have to deal with specific situations. This is the first point. The second is, by definition, we are in a system which is extremely fluid, okay, in which situations are changing. And third, because the situation are different and the actors are capable of adapting themselves, which doesn't mean that they are not going to succeed in all cases. Far from that. They may fail, but they will try to adjust. But let me just give you a couple of examples. As I said, the Vietnamese have been hit very hardly by the Americans. So they negotiated an agreement with the Americans. We don't know the real content of the agreement. But apparently, the Vietnamese are perfectly able to cope with this new agreement. So they've been under constraint, they've been strained, but still they retain their position and their interest, and they are managing the relationship with the United States and China. Because in the case of Vietnam, what is interesting is that a week after the Liberation Day, Xi Jinping visited the countries of the region. And it's extremely rare to have a Chinese leader visiting immediately a region after an important event, as if he was reacting to the US initiative. But that was the case. And there was a warning, because the Chinese understood that Trump 2 tariffs aimed at China, and precisely to limit the possibilities of transshipment. But at the end of the day, it's today very difficult to assess the outcome of this, because there is a real opacity in all agreements which had been signed by the Americans. Now, if you take the current situation in the Gulf, I remember when we were to the UAE, I think it was September 2024, we visited the foreign minister, and he told us that just before receiving the EU delegation, he received Mark Zuckerberg. And the message was, if you want to cooperate with the US on AI, you have to put an end with China in this area, okay? So this is indeed a situation in which they are forced to make a choice. But here again, there is an adaptation, and the new administration has a new attitude vis-à-vis AI and AI and China. So, I mean, the two superpowers are not necessarily in a position to impose their views. And for example, today, it's very difficult for Donald Trump to say to the Gulf countries, you have to do this and you have to do that, because he himself doesn't know what to do, okay? So, but here again, I don't want to idealize the margin of maneuver. I want to be clear about that. I mean, I'm not taking a sort of ideological stand, and that is why I said from the outset that this is not a new coalition of a new grouping of international countries who want to dismantle the Western order. No, that's not their vision. Most of them want to work within the system as it is, but they want to increase their leverage within the system as it is, okay? So, I will say, I mean, I cannot answer in conceptual terms to a problem which remains theoretical. So I can only give you a qualified answer in regard to a particular situation. Sorry.
Okay, so let me take a few questions maybe. Should we group a couple or three and then? Okay, so we'll go in this direction. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. My question was very similar. I wanted to ask, in terms of choosing, which I don't think it's so good at the end to make that option. I think you have to move into more diplomatic option. And what can the United States in this case do to preserve these hegemonic and yet try to gain those countries back? Maybe not fully, but try to do it with different types of policies. So it's not so a matter of like coercive measures. That would be more the case of Russia, for example, or even China. But what can the United States, in your point of view, can do in order to do that and maintain this halfway hegemonic? And I would like an answer of direct policy. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I have a few questions.
Could you introduce
yes.
yourself? Because
Kei Tang, assistant professor at CIDOB Business School in International Relations. So I think the most potential contribution from this book is probably in the last 5 to 10 minutes that you're presenting, which is more about the strategy, how exactly they hatch. You're talking a little bit about Pakistan and India, but I want to first hear more about on this more parsimonious level, on the economic terms, political terms, military terms, how did they exactly hatch? On the first 30 minutes of your definition of all this figure, I'm not sure I'm convinced. I fully understand or grasp your scope condition of who are the hedgers, because for example, some of the figures you use, I think because the countries you chose have drastically different economic types, right? Yeah. Some of them are commodity exporter, some of them are manufacturing export focus. So that's why, I'm not sure like just showing the total exports to China or to the US, is that useful? Also, like you made one mistake when you say like Middle East doesn't export anything to the US. I was just checking EIA's data on the US website. 8% of entire U.S. crude oil comes from the Gulf countries.
But, I mean, it's minimal compared to what it was 30 years ago.
Yes, it's still like 10%, so it's not like zero. So in that sense, just from your brief definition of hedgers, it seems like these countries want to benefit from both sides, right? In that sense, I could also say Spain is a hedger, like Pedro Sanchez tries to, stay in good term with the Western side, but also he visits China all the time, right, to do business. So how exactly is your hedger different from, other concepts? So that's something I want to hear more. What is exactly the scope condition for hedger or non-hedger? And what is the actual strategies they use on the economic, political, and military side to do this hedging? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Over there, third. We take these three and then we do another round.
Thank you. Federico Guerrero, Professor of International Relations in Barcelona. Well, I want to address my question regarding something you mentioned conceptually. You talk about moving from a strategy, hedging, to an actor, hedger. So my question is similar to what the colleague was mentioning before. You have focused especially on this kind of metrics related to material dimensions, okay? But I'm more concerned about the subjectivity of hedgers. So we talk about how to convert this strategy into an actorness, okay? And you try to use that to talk about certain kind of global South states. But we have also Western states that they hedge. Canada is currently hedging. When Canada is approaching European Union, okay, it's trying to hedge. Japan, it's a Western kind of a state that has been hedging in foreign policy. So my question will be, which will be the sort of difference between this kind of hedging of global South states with the hedging we can find with, for instance, classical middle powers?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would start with the final one because I recall it more easily. The first difference comes from the fact, and that is the core of the hypothesis, is that the hedgers are not part of formal alliances, okay? So that's the most fundamental difference. So all the countries you mentioned are part of alliances in which the capacity to hedge is limited. But as I said, the problem is not to say that other countries are not hedging. I'm saying that some countries are hedging more than others and have the resources to hedge in a significant and structural way. So that's the sense of the hedging. So to the second, your remarks, I do believe that the metrics are the most fundamental part of the demonstration because precisely the literature is in IR is very shy to use metrics to analyze political processes. So I do believe that those factors and those metrics are extremely significant, and we can come back to all of them, and they have all a political implication in the case of Vietnam, in the case of India, in the case of Brazil. I think it has huge implication in political terms. And I want to add something because, I mean, my presentation is not a total summary of my book. So please read it before concluding that it doesn't take into account what I didn't mention. Because there are three parts in the book. The first is the hypothesis, the second is the metric, and the third are empirical cases. There's 8 empirical cases which are analyzed in the book. So maybe after reading them, if you have comment or if you disagree, I will be glad to listen to your comment, but you cannot judge the outcome without reading it. Okay, the first one on the US. So I don't want to give the impression that the hedgers are in a situation in which the Americans are losing and the Chinese are winning. That's absolutely not my view. Absolutely not my view. I mean, the competition is open. The resources of both countries are huge, but they are very different. The Americans have huge leverage on all those countries, for example, as a market for their export. And the way they react, that was the sense of your question. Here again, we can try to trace a certain number of initiatives taken by the Americans, even recently. For example, what they did with the Panama Canal, okay? In depriving the Chinese of the different ports to the benefit of American companies. what they've done recently in Chile and I guess Argentina in pushing them to refuse to open space observation centers by the Chinese. So this is another way, another example. Third, the military agreement which had been signed recently with Indonesia to get access to their territory and overfly rights over Indonesia. So we can multiply the examples, and I'm not saying that the United States are losing because they are strong instruments, and they can even weaponize their relations. And my interpretation, we had a discussion with Josep and members of the CIDOB yesterday. I mean, I think that the Sino-American competition is something very important and very serious, very structural. And the role of the United States is, in my view, not decreasing. If you take the case of the G7, the part of the US in the GDP of the G7 is more important today than it was 20 years ago. Okay? So the structural influence of the United States within the Western system is more important today than it used to be 20 years ago. So their capacity to adjust is remain extremely important. I don't know if I've answered correctly to what you asked, but that was the sense of my answer. Did I forget to? Oh yes, there is a point. You're right about the material dimension. But there are non-material dimension in the book. Here again, I didn't mention all the elements of the book. But we insisted on a dimension which is political leadership. And I always give the case of the UAE compared with Kuwait. They have virtually comparable resources. And you have one who is playing an extremely important role in international politics with the UAE, and the Kuwait, which is playing a marginal role. And it has to do with the nature of the literature. So you are right. There are non-material factors which are very important, but I think that it's also by reaction to a literature which tend to underestimate material factors.
Good. Any additional ones? Because I have one that I think was mentioned, but yes. Can you just wait for a second to get the mic? Thank you.
I was just curious, you haven't mentioned Australia in your presentation. It's a wealthy state.
No, it's okay.
I was just curious, you haven't mentioned Australia,
No.
I was just curious, you haven't mentioned Australia in your research because it is a wealthy state that belongs to the South continent, and it has a very significant segment of Chinese population. Traditionally, it is linked to the American politics. So how come you haven't mentioned anything of its presence in this, let's say, Asia-Pacific Rim, as it is called, and you don't consider it an important player in international politics?
Yes, but here again, I have to clarify what the book is about. The book is not about the whole international system. It's a specific hypothesis on middle-income countries of the global south. So to the best of my knowledge, Australia is an advanced economy. First. Second, it is related to the United States with a military alliance. So it's part of an alliance. So the Hedgers are neither part of an alliance nor part of the global North. So that's the reason why all countries of the world which have a potential to hedge are not taking into account.
Hello, my name is Fahad Jamshidi. I'm a lecturer for economic policy. My question is, you have analyzed the hedgers and their leverage based on their resources. We've seen that after the second term of Trump, the European Union is looking forward to strengthening their alliances with India and Brazil, for example. What can we expect from it? What is their point? We know our point of view. What is the point of view of India and Brazil? Are they good allies on economic issues, political or military issues?
You mean the expectation of those countries or the expectation of Europe?
I mean, yes. I mean, what are their expectations from the European Union, and what can we gain if we intensify our relationship with these countries?
Okay. From the perspective of the European Union, it's quite simple. So we want to extend the number of our partnership with the rest of the world in a context which is strained by the American pressure and the Chinese pressure. And as I said yesterday, when I came to join Josep in Brussels, one of my first proposals was to have the European Union, it was in 2020, to sign a cooperative agreement with the CTPP. Because my argument was that precisely we are running the risk of being squeezed by both the United States and China. But he has a chief of cabinet which didn't go along very well with me, and of course tried to kill the initiative without understanding it. Yeah, but on the other side, so for us it's very clear. We want to diversify our partners and increase our partnership with all those countries. So it's very clear, but it's not related. I mean, Trump too has accelerated the trend, but I mean the agreement with Mercosur was in the cards for many years. Yeah, and it was virtually blocked by the French for reasons which have nothing to do with international politics and which in principle run against the vision of the French system, the French have of the international system. Okay, anyway, so on the European side is diversification and increasing of our partners, okay? But I don't think that it would lead to spectacular result. Because dealing with the Chinese is difficult, but dealing with the Indians is terrible. And just look at their tariffs. I mean, as you probably know, the Indian tariffs are much, much higher than the Chinese one. And the problem for China is not a problem of tariff, okay? But in India, it's a problem of tariff and not tariff barriers. So it's extremely difficult to deal with India. But it's a very important partner. But what has changed maybe is the view of the Indians, because they expected a lot from Trump. Of course, they deny it today, but that was not their calculation. They expected a lot from Trump too, because they believed that Trump will take a hard stance against China and that it would perfectly fit the interest of the Indians. And they had been totally caught by surprise when they saw Trump cutting a deal with Pakistan for reasons with absolutely nothing to do with geopolitics, but personal interests of his family in a deal with the field marshal, which is highly regarded by Trump. So it has nothing to do with geopolitics. So they had been cut by surprise, and they started, looking again more seriously toward Russia, and trying to improve their relation with China under the constraint of the Indian business, who want an access to the Chinese market, and probably because the Indians have discovered that the American card remains extremely unpredictable. But the conclusion of the book, there was a short conclusion on Trump, hedging after Trump, and the conclusion is that after Trump, the hedgers will have to hedge more than ever, because hedging is a strategy aiming at reducing unpredictability. And the best example of unpredictability is Donald Trump. So under Donald Trump, you have no other solution than hedging more than ever. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. It's probably more difficult, but that's the case. And for Brazil, I think that they've been extremely disappointed by the European Union. I think. Politically. But of course, they have also an interest in diversifying their relationship, because there is a Chinese trap for those countries, a very serious Chinese trap. And Brazil could be trapped by China, because Brazil is exporting raw materials, primary products to China, particularly the export of soybeans have increased after the tariffs put by Trump. And the Chinese are clever, because they accept to run a big deficit with Brazil, but they are trapping them in the production and the export of primary products and it will have, that's what we say in the book, an impact on the industrialization of Brazil. So Brazil is in the way of disindustrialization. The part played by industry in the GDP is limited. And there is a political risk in all this, because the political basis of Lula is urban and industrial. Comes from the from a trade union, whereas the agribusiness in Brazil is under the control of the right. Okay, so politically speaking, it's a very tricky situation. So, but there is also a risk of being trapped by China. China wants to increase the dependency of the countries on its market, while decreasing its dependency on the other countries. It's fully rational, but the rationality of the Chinese is not necessarily the rationality of its partners. Here again, power politics is a very tough game, though it's not a matter of sentiment or feelings or being nice or cute, but of rough power competition.
I will ask you a similar question now, but related to Europe, which is, yes, are we trapped in the same dynamic that you were mentioning, not so much for the soybeans, but rather for the industry part?
For what?
In the China trap that you mentioned in Brazil, that includes the deindustrialization of Brazil in exchange of this deficit on beans and agricultural products. Do you think that the path that Europe is going with the relations with China can also fall into a China trap, or we are safe from that?
Yeah, okay. I mean, frankly, I don't think that Europe is in a comparable situation or being trapped by China simply because we are perfectly aware of the risk carried by China, by our dependency on China. Of course, China is an important partner for the European Union, but here again, I mean, it's a tough partner. No, I will not say that we are trapped. We are taking measures aiming at increasing our vigilance vis-à-vis China. And I think that the control of foreign investments, screening of foreign investment in sensitive sectors, of tracing subsidies the Chinese firms benefit to export. What the European needs is a more proactive strategy. But vis-à-vis China, frankly, the only way to do it efficiently is to coordinate our policy with the United States. But at this stage, it's virtually impossible.
The scope condition you're saying is global south country. Could I understand that any country in the global south that is not China or the US, they are kind of all hedging? Because from what you are answering, they're trying to deal with uncertainty and they're trying to choose a strategy that doesn't make them to choose a side. So these cases that you chose are just representative of them. But technically, the definition you're using includes every single country that is dealing with US and China, including EU and Canada and Australia. That's why you guys were asking the same question, right? Could we understand it this way?
But as I said in my book and in my introduction, every country in the world aims at hedging, okay? Every country. Niger is trying to hedge. The problem is the resources you have for hedging. And the point, which is very simple, is to say that you have a certain number of actors who are more credible in terms of hedging than others because they have the resources which goes with that strategy. That's the point. Instead of saying all actors are hedging or are doing the same thing, the point is to say, okay, but it's just like in the Orwell farm, they are equals, but some are more equal than others. And those countries have more heft and influence in the international system. And by hedging, they are potentially modifying the structure of the international system. That is why I call the system a hybrid system in which there is an interplay between a bipolar system and a multipolar system.
Any more questions? Final questions and then we'll wrap it up. Any more? No?
Yes. You have argued that many states seek to preserve room for maneuver between blocs. Does this logic of hedging ultimately reinforce the dollar role as a global reference currency, or does it accelerate monetary fragmentation?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I'm not a specialist on finance, but the dollar continues to play an immense role. And it's probably the strongest asset in the hands of the United States, particularly because China doesn't want to have a currency which is used as a reserve currency. I mean, as long as the capital markets are not freed in China, the yuan cannot play the role of the dollar. The question is for the euro, which is a strong currency, but the euro was not built with the idea that it could be used as a political leverage. And that's also the kind of questions which are now starting to be raised. But in order to do so, we need to be more autonomous. And for example, all the idea around about a e-euro, crypto euro, having a system of credit cards which are autonomous from the American one, Bitcoin, exactly. So our challenges the Europeans have to cope with, and I think that the kind of issues on which we can succeed. Because on this there is a reasonable consensus. But I mean, the dollar has still good days in front of him. Yeah, still a future. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the distribution of reserves among central banks, I mean, 65% in dollars. So.
But it's decreasing, no?
Decreasing, but slightly, very slightly, very slightly. And I mean, it's above, largely above the weight of the United States. Okay, it's just like the discrepancy in China between its contribution to the world GDP and its part of manufacturing production in the world. That there is an imbalance. In the case of the United States, the role of the dollar is, as was said by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar in 1963.
60% of the world finance.
Yes, but I mean, I think that the...
No, it's a lot, 60%
yeah.
of the world finance.
Of course, but I mean, through sanctions and the power is, in fact, more important than that.
Right.
Okay?
It has been very interesting.
Thank you.
Let's go to hedge a little bit.
Thank you very much to all those who came despite the rain. Muchas gracias. It was very courageous.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zaki. Thank you.